Today, we're going to look into 4 horrifying cave disaster stories. The first story contains one tragedy, while the other 3 stories contain 2 tragedies each. Let's begin with the first one. 2 expert divers go into a cave that has been closed for 40 years. This cave was locked away because people died there before. What happens when Shane Thompson and Mike Young go deep into the dark water where no one has been for so long? Deep in the heart of New Mexico lies a natural wonder that draws visitors from around the world. The Santa Rosa Blue Hole appears as a perfect circle of crystal clear water, stretching down 80 feet into the earth. Fed by underground springs, this geological marvel maintains a constant temperature of 62 degrees year-round. The water is so clear that sunlight penetrates to the very bottom, creating an almost magical underwater landscape. For recreational divers and swimming enthusiasts, the Blue Hole represents paradise. Families come to swim in its refreshing waters during hot summer days. Diving instructors bring students here to practice their skills in the safe, controlled environment. The visibility is exceptional, making it an ideal training ground for new divers learning to navigate underwater. But beneath this peaceful surface lies a secret that most visitors never know exists. Hidden under the sandy floor at the bottom of the Blue Hole is an entrance to something far more sinister. A complex network of underwater caves stretches deep into the earth, creating a maze of narrow passages, tight restrictions, and dead ends that challenge even the most experienced cave divers. The history of these caves is written in tragedy. In March of 1976, 2 university students on a routine diving class decided to explore beyond their training limits. They entered the cave system during what should have been a simple practice dive. Hours passed as their instructor waited at the surface, growing increasingly worried. Search teams were called in, but the narrow, twisted passages made rescue efforts nearly impossible. It took weeks of dangerous searching before both bodies were finally recovered. The incident shocked the diving community and local authorities. The caves had claimed 2 lives, and officials decided that no one else should risk the same fate. The Army Corps of Engineers was called in to permanently seal the entrance. Tons of rocks and debris were dumped into the cave opening, and a heavy metal grate was installed to ensure no curious diver could ever enter again. For 4 decades, the caves remained sealed and forgotten. The Blue Hole continued to serve as a popular diving and swimming destination, but the deadly passages below were locked away from human access. Stories of the caves became local legend, whispered among diving enthusiasts who wondered what mysteries lay hidden in the darkness. In 2013, everything changed. The ADM Exploration Foundation, a group dedicated to scientific cave exploration, petitioned authorities to reopen the sealed caves. They argued that modern technology, better equipment, and highly trained expert divers could safely map the system. After years of legal processes and safety reviews, permission was finally granted. The excavation process alone took several years. Decades of accumulated sediment, rocks, and debris had to be carefully removed from the entrance. Engineers and divers worked together to create safe access while maintaining the structural integrity of the cave system. By early 2016, the passage was finally clear and ready for exploration. A team of 10 expert cave divers was assembled for the mapping mission. These weren't ordinary recreational divers or weekend enthusiasts. Each team member had decades of experience in the most challenging underwater environments. They had explored caves around the world, mapped uncharted systems, and helped develop modern cave diving safety protocols. Among this elite group were 2 standout divers who would lead the most dangerous portions of the exploration. Both men had spent their careers pushing the boundaries of what was possible in underwater cave systems. They had trained together, dived together, and trusted each other completely. Their combined experience totaled more than 40 years of technical diving in the most challenging conditions imaginable. The mapping mission was planned to last 3 days in late March 2016. The team would systematically explore and document every accessible passage, creating detailed maps for future scientific study. Advanced diving equipment, including rebreather systems and high-tech cameras, would capture every detail of the previously unseen cave network. The first 2 days of exploration revealed why the caves had been so deadly in 1976. Instead of the large open chambers that recreational divers might expect, the system was a chaotic jumble of massive boulders. Car-sized rocks created a 3-dimensional maze with only narrow channels carved between them. The passages twisted and turned unpredictably, with multiple dead ends and confusing branch passages. At 120 feet deep, a massive column of boulders rose from the cave floor like an underwater mountain. There was no safe pathway through or around it for recreational divers. The realization was both disappointing and valuable. This cave system would never be suitable for public access, but the scientific mapping would prevent future tragedies. On the final day of the expedition, March 26th, the plan was straightforward. The team would complete their mapping by exploring the deepest accessible sections of the cave. The route would take them through a tight restriction at 140 feet depth, then down to an even tighter squeeze at 165 feet. The diving plan called for only one diver to pass through the second restriction, while his partner waited in the relatively open area above. This was standard safety protocol for technical cave diving. Never leave your partner completely alone, but don't expose both divers to the same extreme risk simultaneously. The lead diver would be using a side-mounted rebreather system, which offered several advantages in tight spaces. Unlike traditional scuba tanks worn on the back, side-mounted equipment could be positioned and repositioned as needed while squeezing through narrow openings. The rebreather technology would also extend bottom time significantly by recycling exhaled air and scrubbing carbon dioxide. His diving partner carried a camera to document this final exploration. They had worked together seamlessly over the previous days, establishing clear communication signals and emergency procedures. Both men knew that cave diving left no room for improvisation or mistakes. Every move had to be calculated and deliberate. The descent began normally as they followed the guideline that had been carefully installed during previous dives. The line served as their lifeline to the surface, providing both navigation and a psychological connection to safety. In zero visibility conditions, this thin rope becomes a diver's entire world. At 140 feet, they reached the first major restriction. The opening was barely large enough for a single diver wearing full equipment. The lead diver squeezed through first, carefully maneuvering his side-mounted tanks through the narrow passage. His partner remained on the safe side, watching through the clear water as his teammate disappeared into the restriction. The plan was working perfectly until something unexpected happened. Instead of waiting in the designated safety position, the second diver made a split-second decision that would change everything. Perhaps curiosity got the better of him, or maybe he wanted to capture better footage of the exploration. Whatever the reason, he decided to follow his partner through the restriction. This seemingly small deviation from the plan set in motion a chain of events that would test every aspect of their training and experience. The second diver was using back-mounted rebreather equipment, which created different challenges when navigating tight spaces. What had been manageable for side-mounted gear became significantly more difficult with equipment mounted on the back. As he squeezed through the restriction, his back-mounted rebreather began catching on overhead rocks. The passage that had seemed navigable suddenly became a trap. Each movement forward only wedged him more tightly between the unforgiving stone walls. The water around him began to cloud with disturbed sediment, reducing visibility to zero. Panic is the deadliest enemy of any cave diver. Years of training focus on maintaining calm, controlled breathing, and systematic problem-solving under stress. But the human body's survival instincts don't always listen to rational training. When trapped in a dark, narrow space deep underground, even experienced divers can fall victim to the overwhelming urge to escape at any cost. The trapped diver's breathing became rapid and shallow as claustrophobia set in. In a rebreather system, this creates a dangerous cycle. Fast breathing can overwhelm the carbon dioxide scrubbing system, potentially leading to toxic gas buildup. The equipment that was designed to keep him alive was now struggling to process his panicked breathing pattern. Meanwhile, his partner had continued deeper into the cave system, unaware that anything was wrong. He was following the established protocol, trusting that his teammate was safely positioned at the agreed-upon waiting point. It wasn't until he felt unusual movement on the guideline that he realized something had gone wrong. Cave diving communication relies heavily on rope signals and physical contact. In zero visibility conditions, a gentle tug on the guideline can convey important information between divers. But the signals the lead diver was feeling didn't match any of their established communications. The line was moving erratically, suggesting his partner was in distress. The decision to turn back and investigate meant abandoning his own planned exploration. But cave diving partnerships are built on absolute trust and mutual support. The lead diver began retracing his path through the narrow passages, following the guideline back toward where he expected to find his partner. What he discovered was far worse than he had imagined. His partner was wedged tightly in the restriction, no longer able to move forward or backward. The disturbed sediment had created a cloud of silt that made visual contact nearly impossible. Worse yet, the trapped diver was showing clear signs of panic, the one condition that kills more cave divers than any equipment failure or navigation error. The rescue attempt began immediately, but the narrow confines of the passage made it extremely difficult. There was barely room for one diver, let alone two people trying to work together to solve a complex problem. Every movement risked disturbing more sediment, further reducing the already limited visibility. The trapped diver's panic was escalating despite his partner's presence. His movements became more frantic and less coordinated. In his desperation to escape, he began making the situation worse by wedging himself even more tightly between the rocks. His back-mounted rebreather was now completely stuck, and his thrashing movements were causing damage to critical life support equipment. During the struggle to free his trapped partner, the lead diver experienced his own close call. The violent movements and desperate grabbing caused him to lose his grip on the guideline, their only navigation reference in the silted-out cave. For several terrifying moments, he was completely disoriented in the maze of rocks, unable to see anything and unsure which direction led to safety. Through systematic searching and incredible luck, he managed to relocate the guideline and re-establish his connection to the outside world. But precious time had been lost, and his partner's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The trapped diver had now been struggling for many minutes, consuming his limited air supply at an alarming rate. A breakthrough seemed to come when the two divers managed to partially free the trapped equipment. Working together, they were able to adjust the position of the back-mounted rebreather just enough to allow limited movement. It appeared that the worst was over, and both divers would be able to make their way safely to the surface. But the ordeal was far from finished. As they attempted to navigate back through the cave system, the emotional and physical stress of the incident continued to take its toll. The previously calm, controlled dive had become a fight for survival, and the psychological impact was affecting both divers' decision-making abilities. The disturbed sediment throughout the cave created navigation challenges they hadn't faced during their planned exploration. Familiar passages now looked completely different in the cloudy water. Reference points that had been clearly visible during the descent were now hidden in the murky environment. Communication between the divers became increasingly difficult as stress levels remained high. The careful, methodical pace of technical cave diving was replaced by urgent movements and reactive decisions. Each new obstacle seemed to compound the problems they were already facing. The guideline, which should have provided clear direction to safety, became a source of additional confusion. In the chaos of the rescue attempt and subsequent navigation through silted passages, the line had become tangled and displaced from its original path. What should have been a straightforward exit was turning into another navigation puzzle. As they worked their way through successive restrictions, the psychological pressure continued to mount. Every narrow passage became a potential trap, every turn in the line a possible wrong direction. The confidence and systematic approach that had carried them safely through hundreds of previous dives was being tested by circumstances beyond their normal experience. The trapped diver, despite being freed from his initial predicament, was still showing signs of significant stress. His breathing remained elevated, and his movements lacked the smooth control that characterizes experienced technical divers. The rebreather system, which had been partially damaged during the entrapment, was struggling to keep up with his oxygen demands. In an attempt to ensure adequate air supply, he switched to his emergency bailout system, a traditional open-circuit scuba tank designed for exactly this type of emergency. This backup system provided a limited but reliable air source, free from the complexity and potential problems of the rebreather technology. However, the bailout system came with its own constraints. Unlike the rebreather, which could theoretically provide air for many hours, the emergency tank contained only enough compressed air for a short period of use. This created a new time pressure that added to the stress of an already difficult situation. As they continued through the cave system, both divers were fighting against the effects of prolonged stress and physical exertion. The human body isn't designed for the sustained adrenaline and cortisol levels that come with life-threatening situations. Even highly trained individuals can experience decreased coordination, impaired judgment, and reduced problem-solving ability under extreme stress. The navigation challenges continued as they worked their way through passages that should have been familiar from their earlier dives. The disturbed sediment had transformed the underwater landscape into an alien environment where normal reference points were hidden or completely obscured. Each restriction they encountered required careful negotiation, made more difficult by damaged equipment and elevated stress levels. The systematic, methodical approach that characterizes safe cave diving was being challenged by the urgent need to reach the surface before emergency air supplies were exhausted. The cave system, with its maze of boulders and narrow passages, seemed to resist their every attempt to escape. Passages that had been navigable during the calm descent now appeared more threatening and difficult. The psychological impact of the earlier entrapment was affecting their perception of even routine cave diving maneuvers. As they approached what should have been one of the final restrictions before reaching safer, more open areas of the cave, the cumulative stress of the entire incident reached a critical point. Physical exhaustion, emotional strain, and equipment problems had created a perfect storm of challenging conditions. The restriction ahead looked similar to many they had already passed through, but the context was completely different. What might have been a routine squeeze during a normal dive had become another potential trap in a series of life-threatening situations. The approach to this obstacle would test everything they had learned about cave diving safety and survival. Both divers knew that they were running out of time and options. The emergency air supply wouldn't last much longer, and they were still far from the safety of the surface. Every decision from this point forward would have potentially fatal consequences, and there would be no opportunity for mistakes or second chances. The water temperature at these depths was a constant 52 degrees, cold enough to quickly drain body heat and affect mental clarity. As they moved through the murky water, Shane made a deadly mistake. He couldn't see clearly because of all the dirt in the water, so he took a wrong turn into a passage that had never been explored before. Mike watched as his partner disappeared into what was actually a dead end. The narrow tunnel got tighter and tighter. Shane quickly realized he was trapped with no way out and no room to turn around. This area had never been mapped by anyone. Fear took over completely. Shane started breathing fast and panicking, which made his equipment stop working properly. He fought desperately against the rock walls, but this only made him more stuck. Mike tried to save him, swimming through the cloudy water to help. But the space was too tight, and Shane was too panicked for any rescue to work. After 20 years of diving experience, Shane Thompson died the same way as the two students who had died there 40 years before, trapped forever in the dark caves under Santa Rosa Blue Hole. If you want to learn more about recognizing dangerous behavior and understanding the warning signs that can keep you and others safe in high-risk situations, make sure to follow our content for more awareness about crime and tragedy in our society. Now let's move on to the second horrifying cave story. On the sunny morning of May 2nd, 1976, 6 college students from Newcastle University gathered their caving gear for another underground exploration. They had picked Langstroth Pot, a difficult cave system in the Yorkshire Dales, famous for its steep drops, flowing water, and underwater tunnels known as sumps. The 6 friends, Martin Blackburn, Brian Fox, Donald Southern, and 3 companions, had been exploring caves together for many months. They completely trusted each other and had learned the skills needed for tackling tough cave systems. Back in 1976, underwater cave exploration was still new. Very few people had special diving gear, and swimming through short underwater sections without equipment was normal. The method was simple. Fill your lungs with air, go underwater, pull yourself through the passage using rocks on the walls, and come up for air in the next room. This needed strong lungs, good swimming ability, and total confidence. The team entered Langstroth Pot feeling excited and ready. They moved through the first rooms carefully, following known paths and checking their equipment often. The cave acted exactly as they expected: cold, wet, and challenging, but nothing they hadn't handled before. Water levels were normal for the time of year, and everything seemed perfect for their planned route. As they went deeper into the cave, they met the system's well-known steep drops and tight passages. Each challenge was handled with great care. They worked as a team, making sure everyone got through each part safely before moving forward. Hours went by as they made their way through the complex cave. Finally, they reached the underwater passage that would change everything. It looked no different from the many other underwater tunnels they had successfully crossed over the years. Water flowed through a flooded tunnel in the rock, and on the other side, they could see signs of an airspace where they could surface and breathe. The plan was simple and routine. The first 3 cavers would swim through the flooded passage, surface in the room beyond, rest and recover, then keep exploring while the other 3 followed when ready. It was a method they had used many times before in similar caves throughout the Yorkshire Dales. Martin Blackburn went ahead. He took several deep breaths to fill his blood with oxygen, breathed quickly to remove carbon dioxide from his body, then took one final huge breath and disappeared under the dark water. The underwater passage was about 20 or 30 feet long, a distance that should have taken less than a minute for a strong swimmer. Brian Fox followed next using the same preparation. Like Martin, he vanished into the dark water with confidence, his light disappearing into the flooded tunnel. Then Donald went last of the first group. Following the same technique that had worked well for them in cave after cave throughout their caving experiences, they surfaced as planned, gasping and successful in what looked like a perfect air pocket on the far side. The room seemed like safety, a place to rest, recover, and prepare for the next part of the cave. They had done this hundreds of times before in other caves. Surface in the airspace, catch your breath, and continue exploring. This time was different. From the view of the three explorers still waiting their turn, everything looked normal. Their friends had made the swim and apparently surfaced safely in the room beyond. There were no sounds of trouble, no sign that anything had gone wrong. What the three cave explorers didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that the air pocket they had surfaced in was poisoned. The room contained what cavers call bad air, an atmosphere where oxygen had been used up and replaced with deadly amounts of carbon dioxide. The air in the room was poison, but poison that looked, smelled, and felt exactly like normal air. There was no warning, no clear sign of danger. The explorers surfaced, relieved to be breathing again after the stressful underwater swim, not knowing that every breath was slowly killing them. Bad air can form in underground rooms for several reasons. Dead plants rotting in still water can use up oxygen while making carbon dioxide. Poor air movement can let dangerous gases build up over time. Sometimes the rocks themselves can release gases that make breathing impossible. When the three cavers surfaced in that room, gasping for air after their underwater swim, they were breathing poison. The gas was invisible, had no smell, and was completely deadly. With each breath, they were taking in less oxygen and more carbon dioxide than their bodies could handle. The effects of bad air are sneaky. Unlike drowning, which is violent and obvious, carbon dioxide poisoning is quiet and tricky. The victims might feel dizzy or confused at first. Their thinking becomes cloudy. Physical coordination gets worse. And then, without warning, consciousness simply disappears. The three young men had no idea what was happening to them. One moment they were recovering from their swim, planning their next move through the cave system. The next moment their vision was getting blurry. Their arms and legs were becoming heavy, and their minds were losing the ability to think clearly. One by one, all three lost consciousness and slipped quietly under the water. They didn't drown in the usual way. They were poisoned by the very air they trusted to save them after their underwater swim. Back at the original underwater entrance, the remaining three waited for their friends to return or signal that it was safe to follow. Cave exploration often involves long waits as teams move through difficult passages, so at first there was no reason for alarm. But as minutes became hours, worry grew. The cave system beyond the flooded passage wasn't particularly large or complex. Their friends should have returned by now, or at least made some noise to show they were safe and continuing their exploration. They called out. No response came back except the endless sound of flowing water. They tried shining their lights into the flooded passage, hoping to see some sign of their friends, but the dark water showed nothing. Eventually, they made the difficult decision that every cave explorer fears. They had to assume something had gone wrong and begin emergency procedures. This meant one of them would have to exit the cave system and get help from the outside world, leaving the others to continue watching the situation underground. When rescue teams finally entered Langstroth Pot with proper equipment and breathing gear, they made a discovery that shocked even experienced cave rescue experts. The 3 missing people were found in the air pocket room beyond the flooded passage. Not struggling in the water, not trapped by fallen rocks, but simply floating peacefully as if they had fallen asleep. The rescue teams quickly realized what had happened when they tested the air in the room. The atmosphere was toxic, containing dangerous levels of carbon dioxide and not enough oxygen to keep human life. The room that should have been a safe place had become a death trap. The 3 Newcastle University students had died not from any dramatic cave collapse or underground flood, but from breathing air that looked and felt normal, but was actually poison. They had successfully completed their swim through the flooded passage, reached what appeared to be safety, and then been killed by the very thing they needed most to survive. The rescue teams had to use special breathing equipment and work quickly to avoid becoming victims themselves. Even with proper gear, they could only spend limited time in the poisoned room before retreating to areas with breathable air. The investigation that followed revealed the cruel irony of the Langstroth Pot disaster. These 3 young men had done everything right according to the caving practices of their time. They were experienced, properly equipped for 1970s standards, and following techniques that had been used successfully in countless other cave systems. The problem wasn't human error or reckless behavior. The problem was that they encountered a natural phenomenon that was poorly understood and nearly impossible to detect without special equipment that wasn't commonly available to recreational cavers in the 1970s. Today, every serious cave explorer knows the story of the 3 Newcastle University cavers who died at Langstroth Pot. Their names are spoken with respect in training sessions and safety meetings. Their death shows that underground, even the air you breathe can't be trusted without checking. This next story takes a chilling turn that will catch you completely off guard. The details of this story will shock you. The morning of September 11th, 2002 began like countless others in Hawaii's rural fern forest area. 3 hunters gathered their gear in the early darkness, checking their headlights, extra batteries, and emergency supplies one final time. Their destination was well known among locals. The Captain's Path, a winding trail that led through thick forest toward the volcanic eruption area. This wasn't their first time walking these trails, but Hawaii's landscape held secrets that even experienced outdoorsmen couldn't always predict. The path wound through thick plants, past tall tree ferns. Everything appeared normal at first, but somewhere along their route, the hunters made a deadly decision. Whether drawn by promising animal tracks or simply wanting to explore unfamiliar territory, they wandered away from the established trail. In Hawaii's volcanic landscape, this seemingly innocent choice would prove more dangerous than they could have imagined. The island's unique rock formation creates a maze-like network of lava tubes. Hollow tunnels formed when the surface of flowing lava cools and hardens, while the melted rock beneath continues to flow. These tubes can extend for miles underground, creating vast underground mazes. When the hunters discovered what appeared to be a cave entrance, their curiosity overcame their caution. The opening seemed manageable, large enough to explore safely. What the hunters couldn't have known was that they were entering one of Hawaii's most complex lava tube networks. These weren't simple caves with clear entry and exit points, but connected tunnels that twisted and branched like underground highways. Some passages led deeper into the mountain. Others connected to different tube systems entirely. Without proper mapping equipment or extensive knowledge of the specific network, navigation became increasingly difficult. As hours passed, their initial excitement turned to concern, then to genuine worry. The passages all began to look similar in the harsh light of their headlights. Each turn seemed to lead to another identical tunnel, and attempts to go back only led to more confusion. In the maze-like passages, they got lost. Meanwhile, above ground, family members grew increasingly anxious as the hunters failed to return at their expected time. The families knew the hunters were experienced, but they also understood the unique dangers of Hawaii's volcanic terrain. The call to emergency services came as darkness fell across the fern forest area. The Hawaii County Fire Department received the report of 3 missing hunters last seen heading toward the Captain's Path area. This wasn't an unusual call for the department. Search and rescue operations in Hawaii's challenging terrain were unfortunately common occurrences. Firefighter Brent Matsuda received the emergency call at his station. At 41 years old, he was an experienced member of the Hawaii County Fire Department. With years of training in technical rescue operations, Matsuda had participated in numerous search and rescue missions across the Big Island's diverse and often dangerous landscape. He understood the unique challenges posed by volcanic terrain, thick vegetation, and the network of lava tubes that fill the island's interior. As part of the search team, Matsuda knew time was critical. In Hawaii's environment, missing persons faced multiple threats. Dehydration, getting too cold in underground spaces, falls into hidden pits, and simple confusion in thick forest. The volcanic landscape added another layer of complexity. Unstable ground, hidden caverns, and the constant possibility of encountering active volcanic activity. The search began at first light on the morning of September 12th. Multiple teams spread out from the Captain's Path, following different possible routes the hunters might have taken. The vegetation was incredibly thick, creating what locals called green tunnels, where rescuers had to push through walls of ferns, vines, and undergrowth. In many areas, the plants were so thick that searchers literally walked on top of them, never touching the actual ground beneath. This was precisely the condition that made Hawaii's volcanic terrain so dangerous. The thick plant growth created what appeared to be solid ground, but was actually a network of vegetation suspended over hidden gaps, caves, and pits. Experienced locals knew to watch for dark spots in the vegetation, areas where the normal pattern of plant growth was interrupted, potentially indicating a hidden opening beneath. Around 10 a.m., Matsuda was working his way through particularly thick vegetation when he encountered what appeared to be solid ground covered with native ferns. The moment his weight shifted onto what he believed was solid plants, everything changed. The ferns and undergrowth gave way beneath him, revealing a hidden opening that had been completely camouflaged by the plant cover. The opening measured approximately 5 by 8 feet. Large enough to be dangerous, but small enough to be easily concealed by the thick vegetation. Matsuda plummeted into darkness, falling approximately 100 feet down into one of Hawaii's unusually large lava tubes. The fall was catastrophic, a straight drop through complete darkness into the unknown. His training had prepared him for many scenarios, but nothing could have prepared him for this sudden, violent descent into the volcanic underworld. The impact at the bottom of the tube was severe. Matsuda's protective equipment, his helmet and backpack, absorbed some of the tremendous force, but the injuries were still life-threatening. He suffered broken ribs that made breathing difficult and painful. Bones in his spine were damaged, threatening potential paralysis. Internal injuries affected his liver and kidneys, organs critical to his survival. Above ground, Matsuda's fellow firefighters heard his cry and immediately recognized the sound of someone falling into a hidden pit. This type of accident was all too familiar to Hawaii's rescue personnel. The thick vegetation that made the island so beautiful also created countless hidden dangers for anyone working in the forest. The rescue operation shifted from searching for the missing hunters to saving one of their own. Matsuda was seriously injured at the bottom of the lava tube. The smooth, volcanic walls made climbing impossible without equipment, and his injuries prevented any significant movement. Fellow firefighters quickly assembled rope rescue equipment and began the complex process of extracting Matsuda from the deep pit. The opening was barely large enough to allow equipment and personnel to be lowered down, and the smooth walls of the lava tube provided few anchor points for securing ropes. The extraction required precise coordination and extensive technical expertise. Matsuda had to be carefully secured in a rescue harness without making his spinal injuries worse. Once brought to the surface, Matsuda was immediately prepared for emergency medical evacuation. A helicopter was called to transport him to the nearest hospital capable of handling his severe injuries. The remote location of the accident made ground transportation impossible, and his condition was too critical for any delays. Ironically, while the rescue community worked frantically to save Matsuda, the original mission continued with renewed urgency. The remaining search teams pressed forward with their hunt for the 3 missing men, now understanding firsthand just how dangerous the terrain had become. The accident had revealed the hidden network of lava tubes beneath their feet, providing crucial insight into where the hunters might have disappeared. The rescue teams split into smaller groups, each taking different approaches to the underground search. They analyzed the terrain, looking for other potential cave entrances that might connect to the same lava tube system where Matsuda had fallen. The hunters had been missing for over 24 hours now, and time was running critically short. Using their knowledge of the local geology and the newly discovered tube system, the teams made educated predictions about the most likely routes the hunters could have taken underground. They systematically checked multiple cave openings, calling into the darkness and listening carefully for any response. Then breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. One of the search team members, working methodically through a section of tubes several hundred meters from Matsuda's accident site, heard something that made him freeze in place. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably human voices echoing through the volcanic corridors. Following the sound deeper into the tube system, the rescuer navigated carefully through the smooth-walled passages. The voices grew stronger and eventually led him to the 3 missing hunters. They were huddled together in a wider section of the lava tube, suffering from mild hypothermia and completely without functioning lights, but alive. The hunters had spent nearly 24 hours lost in the labyrinthine system, their ordeal lasting through the night in the constant 65-degree temperature of the tubes. Without functioning lights and with inadequate insulation, their body temperatures had dropped below normal levels, causing the confusion and sluggish thinking characteristic of hypothermia. But they were conscious and able to walk with assistance. The rescue team carefully guided them through the complex underground passages back to the surface. They emerged into daylight, tired, cold, and shaken by their underground ordeal, but requiring no emergency medical treatment beyond warming and rehydration. Back at the hospital, doctors confirmed the extent of Matsuda's injuries. The broken ribs had punctured tissue and made breathing difficult. The spinal injuries required immediate stabilization to prevent paralysis. The internal damage to his liver and kidneys threatened his body's ability to process toxins and maintain essential functions. He was listed in critical but stable condition, though doctors were optimistic about his chances for recovery. In the days that followed, Matsuda did in fact recover fully. Now let's move on to the 3rd horrifying cave story. Moved to Australia in 1973 for an even deadlier tragedy. On the deadliest day of cave diving in Australia, 4 family members went on a diving adventure. Only one came back alive. This is the story of the shaft diving tragedy. Christine M. Milot was a diving expert at only 19 years old. She had been diving for nearly 15 years. Her father was a professional diver in Australia and taught his children to dive from a young age. Christine, Stephen L. Millet, and Glenn were all skilled scuba divers. In 1973, they had each earned the highest scuba diving qualification. Christine was even the current champion diver in New South Wales. The Millet family was a very experienced team. Their cousin John H. Bockerman was also an experienced diver. He had been diving for 4 years, but he was the least experienced of the group. On May 28, 1973, 9 divers planned a 2-day dive at Mount Gambier at the Shaft sinkhole. A tiny hole broke through the ceiling of a huge underground cavern and opened to a water-filled cave about the size of a football field. Inside was a lake 20 feet down. On sunny days, light from the opening created a bright shaft straight down to a pile of rocks 120 feet below. Divers used this light like a compass to find their way. On the first day, the team dropped a rope line from the entrance and 8 divers explored around the main cavern. Robert Smith, the president of the diving club, had been in the shaft more than 20 times. Everyone had agreed to stay at a maximum depth of 200 feet and stay in the main chamber. They hadn't made an official group dive plan or assigned a buddy system. On the second day, Christine M. Milot, Stephen L. Millet, John H. Bockerman, and a 4th diver named Gordon G. Roberts planned to do something different. They wanted to enter the tunnel section on the western edge of the cave. Their goal was to reach a depth of 250 feet. They would go down quickly and come back up fast without spending any time at that depth. They were trying to set a new diving record. This was 1973. Scuba divers were using regular air cylinders. Mixed gases had not yet been created for recreational diving. Technical diving science did not exist yet. Divers were limited by how deep they could go because of nitrogen narcosis. This is when nitrogen in the air becomes dangerous at great depths. The divers were definitely pushing the limits of what was possible. They were testing their own personal limits too. Unfortunately, cave diving was very different from open water diving. Christine M. Milot, John H. Bockerman, Stephen L. Millet, and Gordon G. Roberts were about to discover these differences and face dangerous limits they couldn't survive. Everything started normally. The group entered the water and swam down to the floor. Robert soon felt lightheaded from nitrogen narcosis and moved back to a safer depth. Glenn noticed his airtime was almost up and reached to tap his sister's shoulder. But just before he could touch her, she lunged forward with the others over the ledge into the tunnel passage. As divers surfaced one by one, there were only 4 of them. This was shocking. Some divers went back down to look for the missing divers, but found only Stephen L. Millet's camera and flashlight on the bottom. Christine M. Milot and the others reached the ledge hanging over the deep darkness. She knew she would need to be quick and return with minimal time at depth. At this target depth, the air is compressed so much that each breath uses 7 times more air than at the surface. They traveled over 300 feet down through the narrowing tunnel. As they moved along, their air was getting dangerously low and nitrogen narcosis was probably affecting them. But the real danger was the silt. The 4 divers in such a small space disturbed the silt that had settled on the bottom for years. The silt exploded into huge clouds of sand. These clouds would take hours or even days to settle. The silt made it impossible to see. Visibility dropped to less than an arm's length. This was the deadly problem. Without guidelines laid down, how could they know how to get out? Christine checked her air and realized she would not make it to 250 feet. Turning back should have been easy, but it wasn't. After swimming back through the cloud of silt, there was no way to know which direction led back to the rock pile and the glow of the sealing hole. On a cloudy day, the tunnel had no view of the main entrance hole. She reached out in front of her but ran into rock formations. She couldn't tell if it was the wall of the passage or just a boulder on the floor. There was no way to figure out where she was now. The silt had filled the entire tunnel. Her oxygen was running dangerously low. She knew that making it back to the surface would barely be possible if she found the way out right then. In a desperate attempt to find the direction of the passage, she shot up toward the ceiling to escape the silted bottom. Gordon was doing the exact same thing. Both of them were seen in the tunnel swimming to the ceiling of the passage. Their flashlights were sweeping up and down and back and forth. They were trying to see any sign that would help them. There were uneven rocks sticking out from the upper boundary. There was no simple, smooth rock to follow toward the way out. Christine and Gordon didn't know it, but they were trapped in a false dome over this part of the tunnel. Once they were inside, they each spun around and felt along the rocks. They were looking for the way up. Imagine frantically feeling the ceiling and walls of rock all around you, but finding no way out. All of this panic, completely blinded by thick sandy water. At this point, they had no way to know which direction was east or west. They only knew they were at the top of the tunnel because bubbles were collected in the many crevices. But there weren't enough bubbles to help them. The frantic nature of their efforts rapidly used up the remaining air. Sadly, they would not get out of that dome together. They ran out of air, became hypoxic, their bodies didn't get enough oxygen, and eventually sank down to the passage floor. During this time, John was seen swimming with purpose deeper into the tunnel. He was going the wrong way. He was very likely suffering from nitrogen narcosis as he swam deeper into the darkness. Stephen had turned around as well, but he was ahead of Christine and Gordon. He too was running out of air. He struggled to orient himself with no rope to guide him through the opaque waters. He was later found with his buoyancy vest inflated. This would have been a last attempt emergency method to get himself to the surface when his air ran out. Unfortunately, he was caught on an outcropping of rocks and never made it to the surface. Despite an exhaustive search by the surviving divers and police, it took more than 11 months to locate and recover the 4 lost divers. It was truly hard to believe that some of the best trained scuba divers could lose their lives in a sinkhole. This next story takes a chilling turn that will catch you completely off guard. 2 cave divers decided to film their dive through tight tunnels in Tulum, Mexico. They had no idea that one wrong choice would end their lives. Hans and Stefan were very excited about their dive that day. They came all the way from Germany to explore these caves. Both men were experienced cave divers. Hans had done more than 150 dives, and Stefan had done more than 50 dives. They were confident and felt ready for anything. Hans was 47 years old and Stefan was 37. Both were fit and healthy. Their plan was to explore the Colimba cenote. A cenote is a pool of water that forms when an underground tunnel falls in. This creates an opening to water-filled tunnels below. The Actun system is one of the largest cave systems in the world. It has many tunnels, passages, and tight spaces. Cave divers love exploring these kinds of places. The water flows from Colimba towards Gran Cenote. This makes it easy to get out because the water pushes you along. Hans and Stefan wanted to use this water flow to reach Muchas Maze and film the whole dive. Each man brought 2 extra tanks called side mount tanks. They also planned to leave backup air tanks after 30 minutes of diving. These extra tanks would be there if they needed more air. They planned to come back to Colima to exit the cave. It was a risky plan because on the way back, They would have to swim against the water current and squeeze through tight spaces to get back to Kalimba. Other diving teams were also going out that day, with each team starting an hour apart from the others. Hans and Stefan entered the water at 10:30 a.m. on Wednesday, November 14th, 2018. They were excited and ready. The first part of the dive had narrow passages and tight squeezes. With their side mount tanks, they had more room to fit through. The BOA section required slow and careful movement through rocky passages. Some places were only 18 inches wide. Each man helped the other get through the tight spaces. They took turns holding the camera to film the dive while the other person squeezed through the tunnels. After 28 minutes of diving, they left their backup air tanks. They thought they had swum far enough and had used half the air in those backup tanks. But they were wrong. They had barely made it through the first section of Kalimba. The video filming had slowed them down much more than they realized. They left the backup tanks in a place they normally would have passed after just 15 minutes of diving. They continued on through the rest of the Kalimba line. In the Actun system, there are several main lines that go from each cenote. If divers want to move from one main line to another, they have to put down their own guidelines. These lines show other divers that someone is exploring that path. Hans and Stefan put down their guidelines and also left small plastic clips called cookies. These cookies show direction and tell other divers which way is safe. Even though Hans was more experienced, both men knew the dangers of cave diving. But even the best divers cannot survive without air. After reaching Musha's maze, the men enjoyed exploring and filmed everything. After Musha's maze, they had to put down another guideline to reach the main Paso del Laro line. They were 75 minutes into their dive when their dive computers told them it was time to turn around and head back. This may have been the most important moment of their dive. When they turned back, they probably noticed something wrong. They had used air much faster than planned, but they had been focused on filming and did not realize they had broken an important safety rule. Most divers use 1/3 of their air going in, 1/3 coming back, and keep 1/3 as a backup for emergencies. But Hans and Stefan had already used more than 1/3. When they realized this, they quickly turned around and headed back. They removed the guideline between Paso del Laro and Mucha's maze. The video shows that 93 minutes into the dive, everything seemed fine. They were a little behind schedule, but they were swimming at a comfortable pace through Mucha's maze. 7 minutes later, they were removing the guideline between Mucha's maze and the main Kalimba line. They were heading towards the tight, winding passages of Kalimba. That's when they faced a scary moment. They were running out of air. They had to make a big decision. They could either swim against the water current through slow, tight tunnels, or swim with the water flow through large, open passages towards Gran Cenote. Stefan wrote on a special waterproof notepad, "Gran Cenote, okay?" Hans wrote back, "No." Matter where out. Their air was running very low and they were starting to feel scared. They had to pick a path and go towards an exit. Even though the backup air tanks were not too far away, getting to them would take too much time. So they decided to take the longer route to Gran Cenote. They hoped it would be faster. At 106 minutes into their dive, they went back into Mucha's maze and moved quickly to the main Paso del Laro line. They swam along the main line towards the closest exit. On the cave walls were large arrows pointing towards the closest way out. They could see these arrows and knew they were going the right way. Stefan saw that his air tanks were almost empty. He was very scared. Hans gave Stefan his extra regulator so Stefan could use one of Hans's 2 tanks. They kept moving, trying to stay calm, but their hearts were racing. When they checked how much air was left, they both felt dread. They swam faster, which used up the air much more quickly than they wanted. As they got close to the end of the Paso del Laro line, they had to strain to pull air from the shared tank. The tank was empty. Stefan's eyes opened wide. He realized what was happening and swam very fast towards the exit. Hans was shocked. His tanks were empty. He watched as Stefan swam away using the last of his own air. They were only a few hundred feet from the hot OTE exit. This was their moment of life or death. The other diving teams had come back to the surface. They did not see Hans and Stefan at Colimba. Some of the other divers went to Gran Cenote to check if they had exited there. Something had gone wrong with their dive. After telling the dive shop what happened, the divers got new air tanks and went back down the Colimba line to find them. They saw a flashlight on the tunnel floor. Just beyond that, lying on the guideline in the middle of the passage, was Hans's body. His mask and helmet had been taken off, and his air tanks were completely empty. The divers marked this spot and kept going to find Stefan. After checking several tunnels, they headed towards Hot OTE, which was the nearest exit. They followed the short path and could see light shining through the water from the cenote above. There they found Stefan's body, just 60 feet from the surface. Both of his air tanks were completely empty. Even with all their training and certifications, Hans and Stefan ran out of air in the middle of a long tunnel. Somehow, their easy swim through the passages used far more air than they planned. Once they passed the halfway point of their air, their fate was decided. No matter which direction they chose, there was just not enough air for both of them to escape alive. Stefan probably had a small amount of air left that let him swim to the hot OTE exit. He could see the light above, but could not reach the surface. Their deaths were studied using the video where their bodies were found, their dive computers, their equipment, and the notes they wrote. The cause was determined to be gas mismanagement. They should have turned around earlier. They should have known that swimming against the water current while in tight spaces would use more air and energy. In cave diving, the tunnels show no mercy. A single mistake can cost your life. Both of these stories remind us that cave diving is one of the most dangerous activities on Earth. Even with years of experience, certifications, and confidence, divers can face situations where all their expertise cannot save them. In the Actun case, a single miscalculation with air management turned a routine exploration into a fight for survival. In the shaft tragedy, the forces of nature, silt, nitrogen narcosis, and depth, proved too powerful for even expert divers to overcome. These tragic events have led to modern safety standards that save lives every day. But they also serve as a reminder that the ocean and caves demand respect. They do not forgive mistakes. Now let's move on to the fourth horrifying cave disaster story. When two brothers head out for a day of adventure and cave diving, the last thing on their minds is that one of them won't make it home. This is the heartbreaking story of what happened in Goss Canyon. Michael and Paul Hayden had been visiting an old, forgotten water well cave in Goss Canyon since they were kids. From the outside, it wasn't impressive. Just a small, dark opening about 3 feet by 4 feet near the town of La Crescenta, California. The way in started with a flat tunnel going back about 50 feet. Then you had to climb down a slanted hill for another 30 feet. After that, you reach the flooded pool section, only 150 feet from where you started. The cave had dry ledges and water pools that were 100 feet deep, sitting between old well shafts that went up to the surface. Paul had become an excellent scuba diver. He worked as an Air Force pararescue instructor for almost 15 years and was part of an elite rescue team. His teammates said he was careful, well-prepared, safe, and highly skilled. As a master sergeant in the Air Force, he had spent nearly 20 years helping and saving others. On September 17, 2000, Paul made plans to explore some tunnels and well shafts that were farther back in the cave. He was using his mounted GoPro camera as his light and had enough air in his tank to last 2 hours. Michael decided to stay in the main cave area to keep an eye on things. The brothers had worked out a simple way to stay in touch using a rope tied to a rock in the main cave. Michael would pull on the rope a couple of times to check if Paul was okay. Paul would then pull back twice to signal that everything was fine. At first, things were going smoothly. But after about 20 minutes, Michael pulled twice and waited for the usual reply. This time, nothing happened. He pulled again, but the rope felt tight and wouldn't move. His first thought was that Paul must be stuck somewhere. After just a few minutes of this, he had to leave the cave and get help. He knew his brother only had about 90 minutes of air left. Michael rushed through the doors of the Crescenta Valley Sheriff's Department, desperately asking for emergency help. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and the Montrose Search and Rescue Team headed to the scene, along with the Los Angeles County Fire Department. As soon as they got to the cave, they went straight into the water to try to save Paul. This cave system was actually what was left of an old water well system built back in 1915. The well had been left alone and forgotten long ago, so now these caves and shafts were completely filled with water, and the air inside had been sitting still for decades. There were deep pools of water, and between these pools were tunnels completely filled with water. The original well shafts created small spaces, about 3 feet by 3 feet, where water could be reached. Those pipes had been taken out years ago. Now, dirt and rocks filled up the narrow pipe spaces above. Dead plants and other natural stuff released rotting gases down into the chamber below. After swimming through caves and tunnels in the front section, Paul finally reached one of these shafts. Inside, it was only 3 feet wide, which made it pretty cramped with his scuba tank strapped to his back. As he pointed his camera light upward, he could see something silvery and shiny reflecting at the top. It was the surface of an air pocket. Paul was a very skilled scuba diver, but he had never been trained or officially certified in cave diving. His family said he usually carried a lighter with him to test if the air in a pocket was safe to breathe before taking out his breathing regulator. But on this particular day, he didn't have one with him. His camera captures the exact moment when he came up into that pocket of gas. You can see the view looking up at the top of the shaft, lit up by his camera light. Then he takes out his regulator from his mouth and breathes in. The video then shows the wall of the shaft, and suddenly he's back underwater. He makes no move to put the regulator back in his mouth, which tells us he was completely knocked out instantly. Paul sinks right away to the bottom of the shaft and doesn't move again. It was only a few seconds from the moment he removed his regulator to when he went back underwater. So what exactly happened to Paul? Just one single breath of air that has more than 10% carbon dioxide in it will make you pass out immediately. This happens because of carbon dioxide poisoning. Normally, carbon dioxide makes up only about 0.4% of the air we breathe. When the air in our lungs sits next to our blood that's full of carbon dioxide, the CO2 quickly leaves the blood and goes into the air in our lungs. But when the carbon dioxide in the air we breathe is more than 100 times higher than what's in our blood, the CO2 will rapidly rush into our bloodstream instead. In less than 1 second, gases naturally move from where there's more of them to where there's less. Extremely high amounts of carbon dioxide in the blood causes acute respiratory acidosis. This means the blood becomes highly acidic and deadly. When you're in a tunnel filled with water and you lose consciousness, there's no coming back. The full tank of air that sank down with him was completely useless. He simply slipped under the water and died within just a minute or two. There was absolutely nothing anyone could have done at that point. His brother would have been pulling on the rope, getting no answer, but by then Paul was already gone. One choice ended the life of a man who had accomplished so much and had spent his career rescuing others when they were in danger. The problem is that cave diving is completely different. It's its own special category with extremely unique dangers and risks. Proper training, many hours of practice with expert guides, and official certification are absolutely necessary to understand all the different deadly risks that cave divers can face. This next story takes a chilling turn that will catch you completely off guard. When 3 experienced cave divers head out for a simple 20-minute dive, the last thing on their minds is that one of them will disappear for weeks. This is the incredible story of what happened in South Africa's Sterkfontein Caves. Nuno Gomes had been exploring the Sterkfontein Cave system for months. This amazing cave in South Africa was famous for huge discoveries, including a 2.3-million-year-old skeleton. On September 29, 1984, he planned to set up a permanent rope line to help future divers. Peter Verhulsel and Malcolm Keeping would help him by feeding the rope from above and watching for safety. Nuno had done this exact same dive twice before. They swam 396 feet from the entrance through a tight squeeze to reach a small air pocket at the end of the main tunnel. The small room was only about 30 square feet. The men moved easily along the rope, passing dozens of small side tunnels, and finally came up in the air pocket one after the other. They had an exciting talk about how they might be the first humans to stand exactly where ancient people had been millions of years before. This was the last conversation the 3 men would ever have together. Something goes wrong. They started swimming back to the main lake area, following the rope through the shallow tunnel. As Nuno led the men out, he felt Malcolm tug on his fin. Malcolm pointed that Peter was no longer behind him. Nuno swam back and caught sight of Peter's flashlight down one of the side tunnels. Nuno signaled to Peter to follow him back to the rope, and they continued swimming. As they got close to the exit, Peter had disappeared again. This time, after a short look around, the 2 men exited the tunnel and came back up in the open lake room. There was no sign of him. Nuno and Malcolm turned around and went back into the tunnel along the rope. Over the next 4 hours, they searched back and forth along the path to try to find Peter. They had started stirring up the mud with their many trips, so they could see less and less each hour. Although they were worried, they were still confident that Peter was waiting in one of the many air pockets at the end of the side passages. After using all their air tanks, they called for help in the late afternoon. As the 3 men started their return trip, Peter was excited about what might be beyond the main path. When Nuno grabbed his fin to bring him back, he knew that was the right thing to do. But the pull was just too strong for Peter. As he passed tunnel after mysterious tunnel, he finally turned off again and quickly went down a new tunnel. The rock formations in these dark, water-filled caves made even simple paths seem like challenging mazes. Nothing looked familiar as Peter tried to return to the rope. Moving through the narrow tunnels disturbed the mud and made it hard to see. After trying many possible paths, he saw the shiny surface of water above him. He pushed up and found himself in an incredible small room that no one else had ever seen before. It was a huge relief to have the safety of air. He had tried everything he could in the water to find the rope, but now he needed to just stay put and wait for his friends to find him. He pointed his light into the water to signal to Nuno and Malcolm if they came into this section of the caves. The initial excitement started to wear off when no one came up from the small lake in front of him. He turned off his light to save the 30 minutes of battery power that was left. The general rule at that time was to sit tight when you have unlimited air. Peter knew that his fellow divers couldn't be too far away and were probably looking for him right then. After several hours had passed, he knew that a full rescue attempt would probably be happening. His excitement had worn off and left him completely exhausted. He finally fell asleep and lost all sense of time. When he woke up, he wouldn't know if 10 minutes had passed or 10 hours. He was sitting in complete darkness with only very limited knowledge of the cave. His light only had 1 hour total of battery life, and half of that was used during his first dive. So with no light, no food, and no way to tell time, Peter wasn't sure how long he might have to wait. He had plenty of air and drinking water, so the basic needs for life were there. It quickly occurred to him that at this point they might believe him to be drowned. It was a horrible problem. Waiting continued to be the only choice, trusting that they would continue searching until he was found. After that first night of searching, the police locked down the caves until they had finished their recovery mission. Since they had limited resources and were sure it was a mission to recover a body, they didn't come back for a week. The following weekend, they returned again. The police had not allowed any civilians to join their dive mission. Nuno couldn't stand that they hadn't asked for his help. At that point, Peter had been missing for 16 days. Even if he had found an air pocket, he would have died from the cold long ago. Little did anyone know that at that very moment, Peter was inside fighting for his life. He was hungry and in complete darkness. While his flashlight was working, he had noticed several passages that might lead to a dry exit. In complete darkness now, he followed a path nearly 120 feet away from the water's edge. It ended up being just a dead end, so Peter continued to stay by the water hoping for rescue. As time went on, he likely wrestled with his decision to leave the rope in the first place. Now he was too weak from lack of food and sitting alone in the dark for weeks. Studies have shown that people can see things that aren't there and start losing their minds after just hours of complete silence and no visual input. Peter had been surviving day after day in an unknown state of mind. His body was breaking down as his own muscle was being used to fuel his body. Starvation is traumatic all on its own, but combine that with no light, sound, and social interaction, and you can imagine the nightmare that Peter was suffering. He was probably sleeping most of the time because he had no food to fuel activity. The biology of his life was breaking down little by little. Peter was barely hanging on after starving for weeks and losing 44 pounds of body weight. The hopelessness is truly stunning. The police continued their weekend diving for 6 weeks and then finally called off the search with no result. At this point, they opened the dry caves again, but kept the water portions closed to divers. As soon as it was opened, local cave association volunteers started searching for a connection between the dry caves and the wet ones. Roger Ellis led this group, and Nuno joined them. After just a few hours of searching, a connection was found by Nuno himself. Other volunteers found a set of footprints that led to a dead end of rock. It was a completely unexpected finding. Roger Ellis came to a new water connection and was stopped short by what he saw. Laying next to the water was the thin body of Peter Verhulsel. He had not drowned after all. In fact, he lived for an astonishing 3 to 4 weeks. His facial hair had developed into a beard, and he had clearly lost more than 40 pounds. His air tank was nearly full, but it was completely banged up. As they looked at his situation, they saw a message written next to Peter's body. It simply said, "I love you, Cheryl and Ma." There's no way to know exactly what Peter suffered during that time, but he clearly fought to hang on to the very limits of the human body. Dozens of divers were all searching in this relatively small space, but he just had no way to signal the rescuers. One diver had come up in an opening just 100 feet from Peter's location. If he had yelled loudly enough, Might they have been able to hear each other? The echoes of that question remain. If the dry caves had been left open, this search would have found a living Peter in just one day. Peter's autopsy showed that he had died of starvation after more than 3 weeks alone. This was a devastating realization for Nuno.